Darwin and other scientists, such as David Hume, regarded cells as just blobs of protoplasm. They really didn't understand how they work. Today we can look inside these cells. We know how incredibly complex these cells are. If you take a single cell, its size would be much, much smaller than the period at the end of a sentence in a typical book. Yet, this single cell, so tiny, is far more complex than the most modern factory in terms of the functions that it performs. Put another way, so vast is the information routinely managed by only one human body that scientists have calculated what it would be if it were written in books, in tightly spaced books. And what they calculated was the number of books it would take to cover that amount of information of one human body routinely managed would fill the entire Grand Canyon. But that's not the end of the story. It would not only fill the Grand Canyon, it would fill it 50 times over. Just the information routinely managed in one human being. Evolution assumes a change of many complicated events over billions and billions of years, events that require very highly complex changes. Just the steps of development of DNA alone. This is a very insurmountable problem for evolution. To keep it simple, all the DNA and RNA required of all life is a highly complex chain of events. Now, the chain of events in and of itself is very, very complex, but if you take that chain, just the development of that chain, you would find that it's statistically impossible without input from an intelligent designer. Another huge problem is that the amino acids that bond with nucleotides hundreds at a time in a chain, yet the entire chain of each must have the same orientation of that amino acid. It's called either being right-handed or left-handed. Now, this sounds very complex, and I'm not going to get into all the details, but let me give you a very simple analogy. What would it take to randomly produce one single DNA molecule? First, DNA defines the traits and characteristics of humans. Let's assume that a computer randomly typed letters on a page until it perfectly spelled out characteristics of a human being. That alone would probably take forever. In other words, just random letters being typed until you get a perfect description of a human being on a page. Let's just assume each word on the page had to be spelled correctly with perfect punctuation. That makes it harder to conceive, because now we're looking at not only perfect information, but it had to be spelled perfectly and it had to be perfectly punctuated, all by a random computer. Now let's take the simplest aspect of what would have to happen in this building of a DNA chain. Let's assume that this random computer had a 50% chance of either typing a letter right side up or upside down. Now just take that simple idea, and let's assume now that it doesn't matter what it wrote. It could type out anything on a page. No punctuation, no spelling. The words don't have to be right. It's just getting one page of all upright letters. How long, at a page a second, how long do you think it would take for a computer to type that page? Well, it's very easy to calculate it. If you figure 5,000 letters on a page, it would be like randomly flipping 5,000 heads in a row. Well, at a second a page, the answer is it would take 10 billion years just to randomly type all upright letters on a page. But the complexity of the DNA molecule is so much more staggering than that. You would not only have to print one page of all upright letters, but it would also have to spell out perfect characteristics, and it would have to be spelled perfectly and punctuated perfectly. And not only would you have to type one page, you would have to type 500,000 pages just to form one DNA molecule. Let me describe it another way. Imagine each amino acid could either be flipped heads or tails. To work, all amino acids in the chain must be the same. In other words, all of hundreds must be, quote, flipped heads for that one single molecule. Of course, expanding this into an entire creature, you were talking about many thousands of consecutive coins being flipped heads, something that is statistically absurd. Secondly, amino acids first form into short chains. If you imagine each amino acid component as a letter, the evolutionists would imagine a scenario that would require a computer randomly producing letters that become meaningful words. And don't forget, they still have to be all flipped heads first. Thirdly, the short chains of amino acids bond into longer chains. Picture words becoming sentences, and they have to make sense. A sentence of words randomly thrown together would usually not make sense. Now let's take that simple first step. Amino acids have to have the correct orientation. Again, like flipping heads many times in a row. If you were to consider only the number of correct flips, disregarding the words, disregarding the sentences that also have to make sense, the DNA information within a human being would make up about 500,000 pages with 5,000 letters per page. Now let me put this in perspective. If we were to imagine atoms randomly coming together to form DNA, just to get one single page of the correct orientation of amino acids would require 5,000 flips of heads in a row. Now, suppose evolution could flip a coin 5,000 times a second. That's a lot of times a second. It would still take 10 billion years just to get a single upright page of letters. But keep in mind, this is a simple example. It is a small part of the problem. We need 500,000 of these pages of upright letters, or flips of heads. Now, that's a simpler way to understand the complexity, but getting into this in great detail, there are many books on this subject that you can get into great detail on this, but the bottom line is we couldn't form that first DNA molecule, let alone form a first living cell.